Hi everybody, welcome to Module 2. So in this module we're going to start talking in a little more depth about the variety of ancestral hominins that were living across the globe prior to our development or emergence into fully modern human beings. And we're going to start by talking about Neanderthals. So, as a species competing with our direct ancestors, Homo sapiens, Neanderthals thrived until about 30,000 years ago, when the less robust but more intelligent Homo sapien branch outcompeted them. The first evidence of Neanderthal bones were discovered by Pierre-Marcellin Boulez in 1908. Boulez found the skull, jaw, vertebrae, ribs, and long bone remains in a small cave near La Chapelle-aux-Sens in France. The remains were fondly referred to as the Old Man of La Chapelle. Boulez's reconstruction of the La Chapelle bones depicts a Neanderthal with bent knees, kind of jutting head, a really large brow ridge, and curved spine. In other words, Boulez depicted a pretty unintelligent, primitive being. A more recent evaluation of the entire La Chapelle skeleton by scientist Eric Trinkas showed that while this individual suffered from a degenerative joint disease. Additional discoveries of Neanderthal skeletons indicate that many of the features thought to be unique to Neanderthals actually fall within the range of modern human variation. As the Strauss and Cave quote on the screen suggests, despite slight differences in the physical appearance of Neanderthals and modern humans, the truth is that modern humans and Neanderthals are practically identical at the DNA code level. So it appears that Boulez's own preconceptions about early humans led him to reconstruct a stooped, brutish figure, effectively placing Neanderthals on a side branch of human evolutionary tree, not to mention starting all sorts of pernicious and long-lasting stereotypes about cavemen. So let's talk a little bit about the characteristics of Neanderthals. Neanderthals are genetically distinct but similar species to our Homo sapien ancestors. Around 100,000 years ago, there was a critical genetic split in the ancestral human line, separating Neanderthals from other species in the Homo genus. There's three major models that explain how this split happened: replacement, assimilation, and then hybridization. So let's start with the replacement model. According to the replacement model, Homo sapiens evolved in one place and then spread out, replacing other competing populations. Neanderthals, in particular, were replaced by modern Homo sapiens around about 30,000 years ago. And the replacement model argues that there was absolutely no interbreeding between these migrant Homo sapiens and the local Neanderthal populations that they encountered. An alternative approach is the multi-regional model. So according to this model, Homo sapien populations evolved independently in different regions across the globe. Interbreeding between migrant populations of Homo sapiens and local populations of Neanderthals was actually very common according to this model. So what we see then are anatomical features being spread kind of rapidly and evenly throughout the world. The final model is a hybridization model, which basically suggests that there was some interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Evidence for this model is found in mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited through your mother's line, so it's the best way of really tracing ancestry. Assessments of mitochondrial DNA preserved in the archaeological record show that non-Africans contain between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. So, this DNA evidence suggests that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were actually interbreeding, but there are substantial differences between most Neanderthals and most modern DNA, which is consistent with a kind of large-scale replacement model. All right, so we know now that Neanderthals are genetically distinct from Homo sapiens, but that they were definitely interbreeding and then replacing Homo sapiens. But where were they living? Neanderthals inhabited the cooler regions of Europe and Western Eurasia. So as you can see in this map behind me, Neanderthal interbreeding with Homo sapiens occurred largely in kind of Western Europe, but moving into kind of Central Asia and the Middle East. Neanderthals also extended all the way into Asia, into what is modern-day China and Russia, but there was much less evidence for interbreeding with Homo sapiens all the way in these kind of eastern regions. So, what about the anatomy of Neanderthals? So there's morphological differences between Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens, and these anatomical differences are pretty striking. For example, Neanderthal brain size was much larger than that of modern humans. It's a difference between about 1,000 or so cc's or cranial capacity. In addition to having a kind of larger skull and brain size, Neanderthals also had a much longer face. Neanderthals' kind of nose bone also projected out with a wide opening, making it a large and prominent facial feature. They also had a more pronounced occipital bun. That's this part of your head right on the back of your skull, which really supports your neck and jaw. So this much larger occipital bun that Neanderthals had supported a larger neck and jaw muscles than we see with Homo sapiens. Neanderthals also had a pronounced supraorbital ridge. That's your brow ridge right here. So the supraorbital ridge is this bony ridge right above your eye sockets that all primates have and which reinforces the weaker bones of the face. Finally, Neanderthals had a large jaw and kind of protruding mid-face, which meant that they had a weak or receding chin. Finally, Neanderthals also had a space right at the back of the mouth where your wisdom teeth are, where Homo sapiens' wisdom teeth are, but where there was actually a huge space for Neanderthals. So in addition to particular cranial differences between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, there are also clear anatomical differences. For instance, Neanderthals were slightly shorter in stature, on average about 5 feet tall. They had large thigh and forearm bones. They had extreme muscularity, and they also had compact layers of skin that were particularly adapted to the cold climates that they tended to inhabit. For much of their existence, Neanderthals were in a kind of precarious condition where their subsistence relied largely on hunting big game like mammoth and reindeer. So their survival as a species was dependent on hunting skills, which would require the hunter to come within such close range that he literally had to touch his prey before being able to spear or club it. As a result, what we see in the archaeological record is that Neanderthals had a lot of head and neck injuries from these big game hunting encounters. A recent study shows that these kind of injuries that we see in Neanderthal bones are actually reminiscent of those of modern rodeo riders, including things like trauma to the head, neck, and arms. So we talked a little bit in Module 1 about old-devised stone technologies, the first evidence that we have that humans were making stone tools. By the time Neanderthals come around, they've started to really perfect that bifacial flaking technique that we talked about in the last lecture. So the type of technology associated with Neanderthals is called Mousterian. So this tool type was named after the Les Moustiers rock shelter in France, where the first evidence for these tools were found. Mousterian technologies were largely small hand axes and also small kind of spear points that could be used in close range hunting. Neanderthals also produced what's called composite tools, or what is sometimes called hafted tools, which are made from two artifacts put together. For example, as you see here behind me, a projectile point that's been wedged into the vertebra of a wild donkey and would have been used as a kind of early form of knife. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the anatomical features of Neanderthals, where they were living, and their genetic composition. But what was Neanderthal society like? So there's some archaeological evidence that we have that Neanderthals cared for the wounded, elderly, and infirm. Some of this really compelling evidence comes from the Shanidar 1 site in Iraq, which dates between 45,000 and 35,000 years before present. At the Shanidar 1 site, archaeologists identified 9 different Neanderthal skeletons. One of these skeletons was particularly damaged. He was blind in his left eye and had a crippled right arm and leg. Scholars hypothesize that a blow likely damaged the person's left eye, possibly blinding him. And as a result of this damage to the brain area controlling the right side of the body, the individual had a withered right arm and paralysis in the right leg. They also found that in this individual, one of his middle foot bones shows a healed fracture, which probably enhanced his limp. All of the Shanidar 1 skeleton's injuries show signs of healing, so we know that none of them actually caused his death. Our best guess indicates that he likely lived between 35 and 45 years of age, which I know doesn't seem like very long, but for Neanderthals, that was pretty old. This individual probably would not have survived without the care of a social group, given the nature of his debilitating injuries. We also have a growing body of archaeological evidence for at least occasional and deliberate burial of the dead in shallow graves, often associated with grave goods. These burials offer the first signs of religious ideology among our ancient hominin ancestors. So one of the core places where we find this early evidence of burial practices among Neanderthals is the Amud cave site in Israel. So the Amud cave site provides important evidence for the spread of Neanderthals into Asia, in addition to showing evidence for burial practices. This cave site was identified in the 1960s by University of Tokyo archaeologists, and later excavated in the 1990s by a joint Israeli-American expedition. These excavations uncovered 16 Middle Paleolithic individuals, one of which was the partial skeleton of an 8 to 10-month-old Neanderthal baby. Upon the baby's pelvis was placed the maxilla of a red deer, apparently a kind of burial rite. In addition to caring for the elderly and burying their dead, there is clear evidence that Neanderthals, at least some of the time, were cannibals. In 1999, a team of French and American archaeologists discovered the Moula Gersi cave site in France. In this cave, 75 Neanderthal bones from 2 adults, roughly between the ages of 15 and 16, and 2 children between the ages of 6 and 7 were uncovered. In the 2 younger individuals, the jaw muscles are actually cut from the skull. It's not exactly clear whether these individuals, these children, were eaten for survival or as part of some social ritual. Bones were intermingled with deer bones with similar cut marks, suggesting that the cannibalism was probably not linked to a burial or mortuary rite. So, for tens of thousands of years, Neanderthals coexisted alongside archaic Homo sapiens, our direct ancestors. By 30,000 years ago, however, Neanderthals were extinct, and Homo sapiens were the only survivors.